slightly new version of Restream, and we will see where we are going. Welcome to Evolution Hour. A couple days late, but what can I say? We are doing the best we can. La-di-da. Thank you for being on the operation. Woo! Boy, I was having trouble thinking I was not going to be able to get back on. But anyway, we're 28 seconds into it, and we will see where we are. As you know, we are going into the exciting world of Titans. We are finishing up on our wonderful sauropod chapter with some last-minute material on good old Brontosaurus and some stuff on oddball little Chinese taxa. And then, of course, we've got some exciting follow-up material of Harry F. Sanders at Answers in Genesis, blithering on about why phylogenies don't matter. Thank you very much. So, our Brontosaurus stuff, as you all know, there's been a long-going debate going back for eons, 1980s or so, whereas the issue of whether or not Brontosaurus, the traditional nice sauropod that popped up in all sorts of old movies back in the day, was actually just an Apatosaurus, because we know that the skeleton of the Brontosaurus had a head of a Camarasaurus stuck on because they didn't happen to find a head. The reason it was called the Apatosaurus was called that because the heads tended to disengage when the animal dies, and so they get the pieces and they don't have the heads associated with it. Fine and dandy. Well, there was a bit of an ongoing debate as to whether or not if you looked at the skeleton of the thing called Brontosaurus, minus the head, that maybe it did justify being a separate species from that of the Apatosaurus. And there's still some back and forth on that part, but that's kind of a little sidebar on it. They're kind of okay. In any case, it's still part of the same kind, that diplodocid kind, which doesn't bother the creationist model at all. However, there's some interesting little issue. I'll be putting a link up to the 2015 paper on it by Shop that reviews the various diplodocid species and takes that position. And they were basically relying on Robert Prothero at the time, 2015, not entirely being sure of whether or not he was okay with this being other than just an Apatosaurus. Fine and dandy. Oddly enough, for some weird reason, Sarfati and Tay make a point of mentioning that Prothero was born in 1954, which I thought kind of odd. Who cares? What difference does it make? Not entirely sure what was going on in their heads on this little point. Anyway, Prothero objected that there seemed, if in this new systematics that Chop had worked out, that there seemed to be an awful lot of species involved, and given the range of what they knew in their biogeographical element, it seemed a bit much for him, which therefore was bringing us straight into the whole issue of how natural species operate in natural environments and how many species a particular ecosystem can sustain and all of that. None of that got mentioned by Sarfati and Tay. And that would mean that they would have to address the pre-flood world environment and therefore try to map out, do they think that the fossils were anywhere near where they were living at the time the flood happened? Oh gosh, that's a level of detail that Sarfati and Tay probably are never going to get into because nobody in the creationist side can get past a cartoon. It's very, very pathetic. So anyway, the end of their chapter takes a swipe at a supposedly too early advanced sauropod from China, Lingwulong Shengi, from about 175 million years ago, according to this paper, Zhu 2018, which I will be putting a link up to because it's an open access paper. And so they went into quite a lot of fun details. They have a systematics of the various critters, and their placement of the fossil is far enough back into the Middle Jurassic. And supposedly this is a terrible problem because it seems to be throwing off how things are related and what the biogeography was and how things could get all the way over into China and all of this sidebar. Well, fine and dandy, perfectly fine paper from that period, 2018. And of course, we would also have to ask what the pre-flood layout was, what continents were arranged how, and where were the animals distributed, and all of that, which of course they're not going to go into. But beyond all of that data that got left out, at about the same time as they're doing their book, November 2022, this little paper came out. So they're not aware of this thing. And as far as I know, there's been no commentaries on it. There maybe I'll be keeping an eye on the more recent creationist phylogenics. And if anybody who watches the channel is aware of them, anybody mentioning this paper by Dai, new Macronarian from the Middle Jurassic of Chongqing, China, the deposits involved kind of like a bunch of mucky layers and bits and pieces of things. And therefore, there was every reason to think that the precision with which they were alerting as 174 million years might or might not be actually valid as to where this was in relation to the various strata around it and dating of all of that. Well, this newer paper throws a counter criticism to that, and they regard this taxon as occurring much later, tens of millions of years later. And so they're coming in to the zone a bit later in the Middle Jurassic, and their phylogeny is very, very similar to that seen in the earlier paper. It just is they moved that one little deposit over just a tad. And all of them are paying attention to biogeographical issues that, as we know, Sarfati and Tay are paying absolutely no attention to whatsoever. So I thought that was a kind of a funky way for them to end their sauropod chapter. Next, over the next weeks, we're going to be launching into the ornithischian stuff, the armored stegosaurids and triceratopsids and all of that bunch. And we get to look to see more stuff that they're leaving out of their systematics, just as they've been leaving out taxa all the way down the road. Or, in some cases, lumping kinds together compared to what's going on over at the Ark Encounter. So fasten your seatbelts. That's going to be a fun and bumpy little ride. But our other little bit is this phylogenetic trees are not evidence that came out from Harry F. Sanders III. Bless his little heart. He's the kind of the driver of the these nasty evolutionary creationist bunch that they've had their little jihad going on at Answers in Genesis. And some of the stuff Sanders puts out under his own name and sometimes not. And that's apparently a pseudonym of somebody else. And I think we've got it in our notes as to what his actual name is. But he's a weird person with a lot of extremist views. We're going to be alluding to that in Volume 2 of The Rocks Were There. La-di-da. But fortunately, the material that he's drawn on is nicely available, and we'll be putting the links up to that. There's some technical material. He's citing a 2004 paper in Bioessays, which, by the way, he misdated to 2003, so he's maybe going on preprints at sometimes. But the meat of his post related to 4 papers. 2020, How on nematode invasion of Oregon and New Zealand. Sanders skipped a chance to offer the non-existent creationist position on nematodes, what their systematics is. Yikes. Involving some 260 families. So you certainly not are going to be able to defend the idea that they're all one kind, but yeah, we're not really going to get a systematics on that aspect, likely. Then there's a 2022 paper by Cummins on, quote, re-evolution of planktrophy, unquote, which is a swimming and feeding larva mode in Australian periwinkles, which is a gastropod, not the plant of the same name. I had to check that out myself. Then there's a 2023 paper by Thompson on whether angiosperms were hard hit by the Cretaceous mass extinction. It's a very delightfully useful paper because it's going into the issue of, let's see, no phylogenetic evidence for angiosperm mass extinction, which apparently our creationists can't get past the title, because it does in fact argue that at the species level, they suffered quite mightily, but at the higher systematic levels, these larger groups of plants as groups made it through the Cretaceous extinction with less of a bump. And we know that the insects generally went through the Cretaceous extinction pretty good. So what goes on among vertebrates and others isn't necessarily doing the case in other contexts. So it's a very fascinating paper. It goes into wonderful detail, and I strongly recommend reading it. It's absolutely delightful. And it's relating to what their evidence they're seeing down in Patagonia, which is down in Central America. And then there's a Carvalho 2021 paper on tropical forest plants, which is relevant to this, where they're relating to at what systematic level extinction is going on. And then finally, there's a paper by Lee from 2024 on the expansion of anion channels in plants. That little puppy is funky because Sanders listed the lead author as one of the sub-authors, Chen, and so he gets the title of the thing wrong. That's always an indication that the person in question is drawing off of a preprint, and by the time it hits full publication, it may be that one of the authors farther down the line is now put as the lead author when it hits publication, and the date may be different than the pre-publication, and so forth and so on. So these are all little clues that you can't always assume with a sloppy scholar that just because it's listed as Chen et al., that's the way the paper is listed. In fact, this is under Lee et al. 2024. Is he going to allow, Sarfati and Tay going to allow all of this stuff to be, the plants that are involved is to be a single kind or not? We don't know, because they're not going to get around to dealing with that kind of stuff. But anyway, the real juicy part comes from this stupid quote that Sanders concluded from all of this stuff, because he's trying to argue that they're using phylogenetic analysis, and every single one of these papers is incorrectly applying phylogenetics, he rants. Even if we grant that there are no issues with phylogenetic analysis, and there are tons of issues, which, by the way, he does not offer any evidence for, any attempt to use a phylogenetic tree as evidence is a massive category error. Phylogenies are not evidence because they are not data. They are hypotheses, and hypotheses cannot be used to support other hypotheses. Says who? The sheer gutsiness of this has to do with the fact that the phylogenies are based on data. They're based on character states. If they're dealing with organisms at that level, they're dealing with genetic data for those particular organisms. If they're dealing at that level, molecular phylogenies and all the rest. And so the idea that they are just hypotheses and therefore don't have a connection to data, as we all know from cladistic analysis, you can use cladistic analysis to test out phylogenetic propositions by the whole parsimony thing and bootstrap levels and all these little technical terms about how things are given for the reliability of analyses. So everybody will be able to cross-check what Sanders thinks to do, just basically giving it the middle finger, versus what the actual papers do and the various source material that is presented in those papers, to chuckle back and forth. And also notice the fact that if you will try in vain to try to find any creationist accounting of that information, that will explain the damn thing. So it's a monstrous bluff. This thing was brought to my attention. I think Zach Hancock put a poster. It could have been Dan Stern Cardinale in our little science friends thing back a ways, and I was blown away by how stupid it looked. And because of the fact that all this stuff turned out to be open access, you get to be blown away too and see how things are going on. So thank you very much for, if those of you who will be coming in on this show to find out what the hell is he doing on Wednesday, I have been trying and trying and trying to get on Restream. It's now I've seen that I'm in a different format. There's a slight revision of what's going on in Restream. So there's like not a direct indicator of what my signal stream strength is. And there's a bunch of little demo formats and other stuff that's going on. But it's all new to me, kids. But at least I'm back on the air, babies. Okay. Because I was having really big worries about it. And also the fact that I was worried that there was such traffic going on to get onto YouTube because of the last few days of stuff going on with idiot Trump giving his little chit chat with Elon Musk. I'll make a comment on that. But one of the things that struck me, well, a couple things that struck me about Trump's behavior lately, but on the Musk thing, Musk tried to give Trump an out on climate issues, and was because Musk, after all, has been making an argument that we need to get to renewable resources and so forth and so on, which has certainly not been penetrating into the heads of the drill baby drill mantras. Kathy McMorris Rogers, who's retiring as our member here of House of Representatives in Spokane, the one that's trying to run to replace her on the Republican side, seems to be running the same kind of mantras that she did. So we'll see what's going on that front. But Trump clearly wasn't listening closely to what Musk was saying. I'm sure it was just kind of in one ear and out the other without really connecting up on things. And remember, there's no evidence whatsoever that Trump is other than a scientific illiterate on this point. I'm not entirely sure even that Musk is all that familiar with the technical literature on this front, but certainly Trump, dyslexic nincompoop that he is not going to be doing that. Anyway, he then goes on, well, what the real worry is nuclear warming. Like, yeah, if we have a nuclear war, that would be really bad. We shouldn't do that. Fine and dandy. But one of the phrases that Trump argued is that all that you would get from sea level rise is an increase in coastline, which is not true. I think right off the bat of Florida, where the modeling of Florida suggests that basically the southern third disappears if you start melting some of these significant ice caps to where you've got 5, 10, 6 dozen or more feet that's knocking around of sea level rise. Under those circumstances, southern Florida disappears. Well, what that means is instead of Florida coming down and then going all the way down there to the bottom of the state, now that southern blob is now up here, and that coastline that used to be where a Miami crowd are is gone. So the total coastline of Florida would go down, not up. So that means that Trump doesn't know how to do maps with or without a Sharpie. He doesn't have a sense of geography. He doesn't have a sense of what ocean levels mean in terms of, the only way you could get the coastline, the coast increasing is if you drop the sea level, not raise it. So, have an ice age, you got way more coastline under a lot of circumstances there as the ocean level shifts around. So it's yet another measure of what a nutball, an ignorant nutball Trump is. But then the other one that really got me was Trump's absolutely flat earth level stupid claim that Kamala Harris's crowd at the airport was AI, that it was generated, that she didn't have a crowd there. And I'm pretty sure where some of that claptrap is coming from, because Dinesh D'Souza was retweeting some stuff where he was casting doubt. Reflections on the airplane suggested that there weren't actually people there. And who knows where Dinesh D'Souza was getting this stuff from. He's, as I know from looking into his scholarship, he's a superficial secondary source addict, and he gets really revved up on claptrap. So he's running at kind of Kent Hovind level of bad scholarship. And then along comes a Trump that's sucking up this material that he's getting from presumably Foxtrot Pravda and whatever little narrow network that he operates in, and what maybe he's looking at on his smartphone there in between golf shots there at Bedminster. But it's so preposterously wrong, so easily verifiably incorrect, that is a further indication that the Trumpistas are the flat earth of our politics, that they are that bad at information processing. So that kind of gets us up to speed on that. Let me put my thank you note for our little pals who are part of our patrons. I again urge, if you've got a capacity to join as a patron to the project, it helps at every point. And remember, I'm otherwise a Social Security retiree. And I've got a little bit of money coming in from the book royalties from the books, and then the money that comes in from the Patreon. So colleagues, researchers, assistant researchers, friends. If I need to name drop, I will point out Paulogia is a patron to the channel. Dear Ian Chan from down in Australia. So I got people all over the planet who are supporting these at various levels. As always, I'm like Dapper Dino, who points out that at no point, if you are thinking of becoming a patron to the channel, at no point, oh, hello, onward to theocracy with Trump. Hello, Night Air. Yeah, there's a conference coming up in Spokane, which I think I may be able to attend. I'm not going to be one of the speakers, alas, but it's going to be on like Christian nationalism, and Eric Seidel is coming in from American Atheists and others, and it should be an interesting little thing. And I hope to put in a little side contribution if it turns out I'm able to attend the thing about that big culture camp network that is painfully obvious when you've been studying creationism all of this time. You got Tony Perkins and the Council on National Policy, just to show you how that anti-evolution network connects up. Tony Perkins, young Earth creationist, Ken Ham groupie. He thinks Ken Ham is a great Bible scholar, thinks the Creation Museum is great science. He is sometimes the director and sometimes just associated with it. Normally, he's part of the Family Research Council, which, by the way, is one of the people on the Project 2025 thing. And anyway, there's this Council on National Policy that's been running for years. I don't think he founded it, but he's been involved with it. And it's a revolving door of theocratic, anti-evolutionist, anti-abortion ideologues. Kind of odd seeing how the Christian nationalist movement has a lot of atheists spearheading it. I haven't seen that element, although there might be a few poking around on the edges insofar as you've got Trump. Trumpism. You've got a handful of atheists, just as you can find a handful of people in any demographic. But I would contend this. In order to be a Trumpista, you got to have a Tortugan mind shell bad method. No way around it. Because you have to be able to data parse your material and never fact check anything. And so somebody is either a young Earth creationist style mentality, or they are people whose methodology is indistinguishable from a young Earth creationist mentality. So that brings us back to Tony Perkins and all that. The Council on National Policy practically staffed the Trump administration because they were very slow behind the curve on getting people in place. And so there were a lot of positions to be filled. Remember, part of the Project 2025 plan that the Heritage Foundation wants is to make much more of the bureaucracy in the government basically patronage positions, like back to 1870. And what could go wrong on that? It's a disastrously bad idea. The Discovery Institute was very briefly on the advisor list of Project 2025, and then decided, oops, when it started blowing up in everybody's face, they pulled back. But they were briefly on it for a while. Whether or not they're officially on it doesn't matter, because their worldview is very concordant with that Tony Perkins worldview, and throw in Jerry Falwell worldview, throw in Glenn Beck, throw in Ann Coulter, throw in a whole bunch of people who range across the. Ann Coulter is an anti-evolutionist. Dinesh D'Souza is kind of wiffle-waffly on the subject. And that means that if you need an easy-peasy diagnostic, generally speaking, ask if they believe in evolution or not. And if somebody doubts evolution, odds are they're going to be orbiting that Trumpista thing. They may or may not be somebody who would qualify as a full-out Christian nationalist. somebody like Kathy McMorris Rogers is an enabler. She doesn't come out as some of the same bits of a full-out theocratic style person, but yet she acts as a functional enabler, and certainly acted as an enabler for Donald Trump all the way through his administration, voted against his impeachment both times, and is like nailing Jello to the wall on an awful lot of important positions, including climate change and health policy, and a lot of other things. And what's worrying me is her potential successor, Baumgartner, is just as much of a fog bank as she is, which brings up the methods issues that I will be calling attention to and probing on if I turn out to be attending this thing. Yes, a Venn diagram conspiracy thing has a lot of overlaps. Yes, and this has been a case that has been going on for a way long time. That's one of the reasons why this has been such a big bear of thing that I've been dealing with, is because you have a relatively common set of players here. This is not something that's really hidden. It's not hard to find, but the Culture Camp Enablement Network is not prone to be advertising themselves outside their little network. I began to spot the commonality of names as you started flipping back and forth in this area. So if you needed a Venn diagram to simply focus on the Christian nationalist angle, is to miss all of these little fellow travelers that are knocking around in the periphery. I mean, is David Klinghoffer, who's Jewish, at the Discovery Institute, is he a Christian nationalist? Probably not technically, but is he kind of theocratic in the way he'd be looking at stuff? An area that this also overlaps is the number of anti-vaxxer ones. Douglas Axe has been blither-blathering on that. The late Philip Johnson from the Intelligent Design movement was an AIDS denier. Quite a few AIDS deniers. I think Paul Nelson and a few others, or Jonathan Wells, orbit that block as well. And so there's an intricate thing. Ironically, Carter and either Snelling or Sarfati, I think Snelling, are unusual for anti-evolutionists in that they were okay with the COVID vaccine. And they even got a lot of flack on that from the other people in their little network on there. And a recent video from Joel Duff was noticing that they had to kind of, both CMI and AIG were kind of having to respond and repeat this issue about the rise of too extreme pseudoscience for them positions, like the number of flat earthers who deny the moon landing in that they're discovering in the young earth creationist movement is something that's getting these more techno loving creationists to start worrying. Oh, well, yeah. So they have to try to find some way to parse their methodology to somehow keep their mythology correct and intact, while at the same time excluding the nutballs. So nothing is more hilarious than to see somebody like that. There's been several posts on flat earthers at AIG and ICR and that over the years. Kent Hovind has done a video complaining about flat earthers, which is just, from a methods point of view, absolutely hilarious. So anyway, to keep all the players straight, some of these things go way back, because if you look at Jerry Falwell from the 1970s, as opposed to Jerry Falwell Jr., who has more keeping the pants zipped problems there at Liberty University. But that culture camp worldview has been fairly stable in its belief systems. I mean, it's been anti-environmentalist, anti-abortion as the primary issue. That's certainly the case for the ACLJ that Jay Sekulow is involved with. That's Pat Robertson's legal arm. Sekulow was on the defense team for Trump during the impeachment hearings. You've seen all these little names starting to connect up in all this thing. It's a small playing field. And then you've got the sidebar types of the Silicon Valley connections that Vance has, that bankrolled his campaign, and that kind of intersects with that kind of big business deregulation, don't rock the boat when it comes to rich people and the like, that you get with elements of the traditional big businessy Republicans, as opposed to the kind of blow everything up populism of a Marjorie Taylor Greene or a Steve Bannon, who I regard as a bloated anarchist. He wants to smash everything, provided his privilege isn't buffed into. So long as he can keep his finances straight, he's happy as a baby Jabba the Hutt going on there. So it's an interesting mixture of people. But one bad method to rule them all, which is the phrase that I've been popping up on Twitter there, and I'll type it in here. The little riff off of the One Ring to Rule Them All from Lord of the Rings. And I seriously mean it, that there is to believe. There's all sorts of things that are, if you consider Bannon got popular from Gamergate. Yeah. You see, there's all these little cross connections that stuff goes on. Remember, Bannon has his Breitbart. He founded that and eventually got kind of bumped out of that. But Breitbart is like nutball central for an awful lot of Trumpistas. The great rumor mill factory. You've got a bunch of different venues in these areas. Breitbart, you've got Fox Trump Pravda, you've got Newsmax, One America Now, OAN. To some extent, orbiting at the edges is the Falun Gong Epoch Times. That certainly fuels anti-vaxxers, and also Merkel is one of their pundits there, and as well as being really big on Trump. You've got a branch of extremist, theocratic, conservative Catholics. Candace Owens has been sucked into that world lately. And so there's a constantly shifting scorecard of people who are influencers. And of course, you've got illiterate boob, but a millionaire illiterate boob, Aiden Ross, who had that interview with Trump and gave him a cyber truck and a Rolex watch. So he's got enough scratch to do that. I think on the finance front, it's kind of funky to notice regarding the Trump campaign. Trump, apparently the Trump previous presidential efforts means they still owe a couple $1,000,000 to various towns, including Spokane, Washington, I believe, for failing to pay bills. And so my understanding is the latest rally that Trump has gone to, the city required ponying up money in advance to make sure that they were covering security and the expenses that would be entailed by the presidential candidate swooping in. And that little nickel and diming them issue could be really fun. The little problems they had with his 757. It's a fairly older plane, but Trump always has to try to maintain all of that. And he had to fall back on renting Epstein's old plane. I mean, did these people check these little details? I'm not entirely sure. But anyway, Trump apparently is melting down in terms of the fact that his rallies aren't nearly as big as he does, and his poll values are such. And the issue of whether or not the trajectory of the Harris-Walz campaign is going to increase the amount of new voters and energized voters on a level that will be unbeatable if that trajectory keeps going. You've got millions and millions of people who were kind of bummed out by a Biden Trump rematch, and we're thinking nothing could possibly change, and suddenly they're energized. And if they register and end up voting, totals of millions can add an enormous amount and can even do some flips. I've been pointing out to people that Florida, which seemed impossible to move. Hi, Lisa. Yes, I've been trying to get on for days and days, and at last, at this almost normal hour, except just 48 hours late, it's finally got on, and we're doing just fine on that little front. Florida, if instead of us replaying 2020, and we definitely don't want to repeat 2016 because that's how Trump got in power. Instead, what if we got a 2008 where Obama took Florida and took Florida again in 2012? And I looked up the vote on Florida. Out of 11 million votes, Trump won the state by about 380,000, which means, assuming the vote stays the same and you bring in 1 million new voters, young people, or maybe even flipping of some who are just tired of Trump so that can be brought down. It's not impossible that Florida could flip. I think it's a tougher haul for like Texas and some of these other states. And because Harris, who was already a live wire for raising money, even before she became the official candidate, and that just has jumped up into the hundreds of millions level as enthusiasm comes into play. So the game's afoot, kids. Yes, well, that'd be fun, Maine. Yeah, it's going to be kind of interesting to see what's going on as long-term demographics on things are happening, because we have to remember that, especially young people, and I'm not a young person, although I'm not planning on checking out anytime soon, but still, somebody that is the co-author Jackson Wheat's age, who is in his 20s, he's going to be living well into the rest of the century, and maybe even as an old fart seeing the 22nd century dawn. And that means the decisions that we are making now in our elections and in policy and in tax policy and environmental policy and energy policy and all these other things are going to be affecting things for decades and decades and decades. And we still have to maneuver around all of those idiot Trumpista judges that were put on the court during the Trump years. That's going to be like a dead weight that we got to maneuver around. But if you have the votes, and if you have enough of a movement at the state levels, all the gerrymandering in the world can't stop that. And you have a situation where, in principle, if you have a really energized progressive period that's on a par with what was happening 110 years ago in the time of Teddy Roosevelt and in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, footnote with Woodrow Wilson also being a flaming racist. Let's not repeat that one, shall we? But nonetheless, enormous things were done in creating reforms, in creating the Federal Reserve System and income tax and national parks and a whole bunch of things. I thought the Brontosaurus was another that I know that as I pointed out, it's still a legitimate issue that their argument in that shop paper, would it surprise me to regard Brontosaurus still as just a sufficient variant on Apatosaurus that they are really the same species, or rather the same genus? It doesn't shock me, and I don't lose any sleep over it. But the arguments that they were making in their systematics, and that's one of the reasons why they came up with so many different species that was bothering Prothero, is that you could legitimately regard it perhaps as a separate species. And so it would look still, as my great-grandmother would have said, no wild horse is going to stop to look at it. Anybody that would just do a quick glance at a Brontosaurus skeleton and an Apatosaurus skeleton is going to say they look a lot alike. So it's just a matter of the little fiddly bit things in terms of number of vertebrae on particular details on particular points. The fact that you don't have the heads of either one of them really to go with is a tricky little thing to do, because those are so rare, because they tend not to be preserved. They break off when the ligaments break and all that during the circumstances, non-flood, forming their livelihood. So anyway, we're going to be knee deep then, and I may even be bringing in some of my little dinosaur models for the ones that are going to be coming up, where we're going to be talking about Scelidosaurids and Scutellosaurids and a bunch of ceratopsids and protoceratopsids and Psittacosaurids. And there's a whole bunch of cute little saurids that are knocking around, which are going to be knee deep in the issue of how much data suppression they're dealing with and how squishy their kinds are. And plus, whether or not they're bumping into any of the technical literature, and how much more are they just going to be reprising their own creation as to phylogenics. We'll be finding that out, because I've only done the preliminary scan through to see how many kinds supposedly are involved, and I haven't looked yet in the details of the source base, which we'll be getting into in the weeks to come. In addition to which, every other week, next week, we'll have another one where we'll have more on our little pals at the Casey Luskin Discovery Institute 800 plus list. This one is kind of a little sidebar, because it came up in relation to a new post that Zach Hancock was jaw-dropping on, and Dan Stern-Cardinale and a few others, and I think Paul Braderman and others were all commenting on it. And so that's kind of the springboard. And it turned out, in researching the background of the issue that was being raised by this Casey Luskin post and the video chat that he was having, it brings up another one of the papers, backdoor, that's on the Luskin list. So that'll all be the story for next week. Anyway, so let's put up our advert for the wonderful Rocks Were There book. Remember, we got these wonderful little books here you can get for your own personal library. I can attest to the fact that from people from Dapper Dino to Vice Rhino to Dan Stern-Cardinale, they all are delighted with the work and use it as a reference base. I know P.C. Myers has a copy too, which he uses occasionally as a reference base. How many ages of dinosaurs exist? Of ages of... you could argue if we're trying to think of like the big picture of what's going on in the critters, we've got the early phase of dinosaurs taking place in the Triassic, when dinosaurs are just coming on the field in a context in which there are a bunch of things that are almost dinosaurs. So you got an awful lot of things that are kind of teeter-totter balancing act things, basing on largely bipedal, although some are more quadrupedal, with a balancing tail and a kind of a long neck sticking out. And they're relatively small. If you think about the Jurassic Park, one of the Jurassic Park movies where the little, I think number 2, where the little itty bitty compsognathids are running around, that's about the typical size of these little small forms. And some of them are not, they're close to the dinosaurs, but not actually there. And then there are these Herrerasaurs that are dinosaur, but they've got some characteristics that are a little bit more like the sauropods versus Saurischians versus the ornithischians. And so they were taxonomically, and still are to some extent, taxonomically quirky as to where they belong. And that's part of the things that we've discussed in previous episodes now and then, where there was still an ongoing issue about how these early ones are diverging, and is it a branch that's going off to the sauropods first, and then later on theropods are coming in, and so the ornithischians are actually kind of over here, and that, and because the fossil record for a lot of these things are fairly sparse, and a lot of them are fragmentary. You've got things from the Ischia in South America. You've got things from the deposits in, I think, the Karoo. No, it's Permian. But anyway, there's only a relatively small number of spots where you got Triassic deposits to be able to look in that are relevant to the issue of origins of dinosaurs, and to some extent mammals and other things that are going on. But anyway, so you get an initial radiation in the later Triassic, where dinosaurs are really starting to kick in. And this must have something to do with the fact that the climate is shifting. There's more of a hotter weather, and some of the super rainstorms that occurred in the early Triassic after the big Permian mass extinction. The climate is kind of shifting down. You still have a Pangea supercontinent, although there's an awful lot of stuff that's going on. The beginnings of the Atlantic Ocean breakup are occurring during the Triassic. There's the CAMP, Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. That's the big Deccan trap almost sized volcanic deposits that are the beginning of the zipper that's pulling the Atlantic Ocean apart. So you got interesting things that are happening going on. During the next phase, then, by the time you start sliding into the Jurassic, when you start have enough fossils that are putting blips on the scope, you're seeing these relatively small plateosaurs and the like starting to grow up by the time you get farther into the Jurassic, in a proliferation of bigger sauropods, brachiosaurs and mamenchosaurs, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on. And these continue in various locations, some of them persisting all the way into the Cretaceous. Others kind of have their big heyday during the Jurassic. So there is a faunal turnover, and some of these taxa continue on into that area. The other factor that's starting to alter the dynamics of things is the rise of angiosperms. And so you've got plants, partly perhaps as a defense mechanism against predation by these proliferating dinosaurs. You find a different repertoire of groups. You've got your ornithischian dinosaurs, of which we're now moving into that group, the ceratopsids, and later on they'll have a section on the hadrosaurs in Sarfatti and Tay. that have much more specialized dentition, things that are designed to act as grinding teeth, because you're now starting to eat stuff that's got kind of the consistency of celery. And so the rake it off of the limb bit that the sauropods could do, and still do to the extent that conifers are still operating in the ecosystem, and they're the only ones that got necks high enough to deal with. No hadrosaur has got a browsing range that can compete with a tall-necked sauropod. And they're altering the dynamics of things. You've got the little psittacosaurids in Asia that are sort of branching off into protoceratopsids that then also spread along into North America. And in North America, that develops into the full-blown ceratopsids, and a little bit maybe going back into Asia, but it's basically North American taxa. But they can only spread so far because there's a great big seaway that blocks off that from eastern North America. And so all of that biogeographical material and all that makes for some absolutely fascinating bits as we move into the Cretaceous, by which time, from mid-Jurassic, we were seeing the early developments of these feathered theropods. And those are now starting to develop flyer forms in the Jurassic. And then they really start developing niche groups during the Cretaceous, because you've got 3 or 4, and there may turn out to be even more groupings of these things. The enantiornithine birds, which don't make it through the KT extinction, the ornithines that are developing at the late Cretaceous, and that they continue on, they survive and proliferate into the birds that we're familiar with. And then there's also weird ones like Microraptor with its 4 feathers on both front and hind legs. And then you've got the little Zhigi or whatever it's called. It's like a bat membrane thing, but it's also got some feathers. And there may have been other forms of theropod flyers that we just have never found in the fossil record yet. So we can't presume that's the only groupings that have been doing it, because we're talking about a period, 150 million years ago down to 65 million years ago is 90 million years. So you got a lot of room for stuff to go on in there, and a lot of things for things to have a little heyday that runs for 20 or 30 million years and boop, gone. And it may never end up in the fossil record. So that gets some of the little thing. And of course, you got another matter going on with your theropods. When I was first getting involved in studying dinosaurs as just a layperson back in the 80s, seriously, I was a dinosaur kid, but it was really in that revolution that was taking place in the 1980s. David Norman's Dinosaur Encyclopedia came out at that point, and boy, did I eat that up. You had kind of like an amorphous carnosaur group that had little ceratosaurs and allosaurs and tyrannosaurs, and it wasn't entirely clear. In close groups, they could get material, but they were still kind of feeling their way. Well, boy, do we know a heck of a lot more today. And so now there's a much better thing about how separate these lineages were and how they were going along very, very long, detailed tracks, and of which, as we already saw with the Sarfatian Tay crap on the theropods, boy, they're not diving very deep in this stuff and basically retreading material from CMI and not going very deep on a lot of taxa. And we're going to be seeing pretty much the same thing going on, where we'll be now dealing with more critters that are more notable in the Cretaceous, which are those ornithischians, the hadrosaurs, and the various armored dinosaurs. But boy, there are little exceptions to that, because every one of these things had an evolutionary origin going back beforehand. And what Sarfatian Tay do is, when you got these ones that are kind of squishy and hard to categorize, well, we'll just leave them out of the book and not bother about them at all. So anyway, so it's going to be a fun little operation to go on. Apparently, there's going to be like 2 big chapters in the book that's going to rip off and try to undermine the bird dinosaur bit, where, spoiler alert, you're going to get a bunch of Allen fiducia. All of that. I mean, that's their go-to stuff. They can't possibly avoid all that. So it'll be fun to see whether any of it hits stuff that's not already been hit by creationist apologetics in terms of the technical literature, which I've got, a pretty wide swath of what fiducia has contributed over the various years. And so I'll be able to know which stuff has already been hit and which stuff is new. So we'll find out all about that. So let's put up our little advert for the Rocks Were There which if you don't have it, please get. And there's going to be volume 2 that we're going to be talking along. And on top of which, consider if your library is okay, as most libraries are, public libraries, that you can donate books. So you can get the novels, as well as I donated copies of my novels to our local Spokane library, so people can read them there. The technical science stuff, I donated a copy of. Rocks were there, but I don't know whether or not they've accepted the thing yet, and so that's it's still in their little bureaucracy, and it may never rematerialize. I don't know, but at any rate, we're proceeding as best we can. So let us put up our share screen again. So our little advert that is very noisy that dear sweet Peter constructed can play. The second book should be just as meticulous as the first. As always, there will be links to Patreon and all the books each week, as well as all the technical material that we allude to, and we will be keeping at that one way or the other. This will count as if it had happened on Sunday. I'll be keeping track of it from my date point of view, but then our next show will hopefully be on schedule on Sunday. As we now have this new format, and we will cross our fingers to where they finally got through their tinkering, and we'll be able to proceed more like normal, because I'm an old person. I like things to be stable and nice and familiar, because I'm an old fart. I'm amazed that I can do all of this stuff to begin with, and I want none of the inconvenience. And plus, when I see occasionally things glitching up on the ones that are buying these much more elaborate platforms and things, and they're still getting troubles, I'm going, well, okay. Anyway, everybody stay safe. If you've got in like areas that have had flooding, or worse, if you're in places where bombs are dropping, stay super duper safe. We're kind of in a little more stable climate situation here, at least for a while. We're in a more seasonal weather here, so we're like in the high 80s. Which is a little bit more normal for August in Spokane. Whereas other places in the country where temperature records have been hit, I do not envy you in the least. So anyway, everybody stay safe. Watch out for wooden penguins, and we will all see you next week, kids. We are ending the stream.